Everyone is talking about Arsenal winning the Premier League, but no one is talking about their defensive numbers. And when you're a sicko like me, you look at things like defensive numbers. So on the board here, what we've got is a plot of the expected goals that Arsenal have conceded across the course of the season on a 5-game rolling average. So each of these data points is 5 games of XG averaged out. And as we can see, things start off pretty well for Arsenal this season. They rarely go above 1 XG conceded. And actually, just before the World Cup period starts, we can see they're right down at 0.5 expected goals against in their games on average across 5 games, which is really, really impressive. But actually, what happens is they come back from the World Cup, and immediately when the post-World Cup data enters the data set, we can see things ramping up quite considerably. Now, there's a couple of peaks here that we need to talk about. Now, this first peak here represents the downturn that Arsenal had in February. They dropped points against Everton, Brentford, and Manchester City in that period, so it makes sense that their expected goals against numbers would be going up. Now, this period also coincides with Thomas Partey being injured and Jorginho coming in, so you might think that correlates with why Arsenal get worse defensively, and the numbers do start dropping off almost immediately after that time when Partey comes back in. But there is some context here that we need to talk about, and that is the Leicester City game, because Leicester City play against Arsenal, they lose, and they put up a total of 0 expected goals against Arsenal, and so that figure enters the data set. We can see it enters around here, so that explains why the numbers drop right down, and then they start going back up as soon as that Leicester City figure drops out of the data set again. So Arsenal's numbers are still quite unimpressive over this period, and most importantly, it's much worse after the World Cup than it is before the World Cup. Now, this shows up really nicely on this table of Arsenal before and after the World Cup. So we've got pre-World Cup numbers here, post-World Cup numbers here. Expected goals against, we can see per 90 minutes, Arsenal were around 0.8 before the World Cup, and that goes up to 1.2. That's 0.4 worse than it was. That's a hefty figure. That's a big chance more than they were conceding in the games before the World Cup. And then with the actual goals that Arsenal have conceded before and after the World Cup, we can see that it's matching the underlying numbers. So again, they're conceding more goals than they were before the World Cup. Now, you might think that it's fine to get a little bit worse defensively if you're getting better in attack, but that hasn't been the case for Arsenal. So if we look here, the expected goals numbers before and after the World Cup, we can see that Arsenal are tracking exactly the same level of expected goals as they were. And we can see that when it comes to actual goals, they are scoring slightly more than they were, but again, it's not a huge amount more. So Arsenal's defensive numbers have definitely got worse after the World Cup, and that hasn't been matched by an improvement in their attacking numbers. Now, I wanted to dig into the data to see where this discrepancy was coming from. So what I've done is I've made 2 shot maps. This is the shot map for Arsenal in all competitions before the World Cup, and this is the shot map from Arsenal after the World Cup in all competitions. Now, there's a lot of dots on this graphic. Don't worry too much about it, because actually if we look in one specific area, we can see a big difference. So focus on the 6-yard box here. There are 7 chances that are generated before the World Cup in that area against Arsenal. And importantly, there's no red dots. Red dots represent goals. Now, if we move across to the other side, this is post-World Cup, we can see a very different picture. There's a lot more chances, and those chances are much bigger because it's very close to the goal. And we can also see a number of red dots here as well. So those chances are actually turning into goals as well. Now, for context, it's worth recognising that these 2 viz represent different numbers of games. So before the World Cup, Arsenal played 21 games. After the World Cup, they've played 18 games in all competitions. But despite the fact that there's fewer games here, we can see that Arsenal have conceded more expected goals in 18 games than they have in the 21 games preceding the World Cup. Now, why might that be the case? Well, I think there's 2 things we need to look at here. The first thing is the shots on average. Now, we can see that before the World Cup, Arsenal are conceding around 8 shots per game. After the World Cup, that jumps up to around 9 shots. So the volume jumps right up. But it's not just the volume of the chances that they're conceding, it's also the quality of those chances. So we can look at the average quality of each of the chances before the World Cup, and that is down at 0.9 expected goals per shot. After the World Cup, that jumps up to 0.12. That's a pretty big jump up. And so Arsenal's defensive numbers come from the fact that they're conceding more and better quality chances after the World Cup. Now, this got me thinking, why are Arsenal suddenly conceding bigger and better chances? And I immediately jumped my mind to the Bournemouth game. So this is the shot map from the Arsenal-Bournemouth game. You may remember Arsenal won the game quite late on with a really nice finish from Reiss Nelson to take all 3 points. And actually, if we look at this shot map, something really interesting shows up. Now, Arsenal put up 2.6 expected goals, which is double what Bournemouth put up, so you'd expect them to win that game. But actually, if we look at those chances, something really stark shows up, because that 2.6 XG from Arsenal comes from 31 shots. You can see the shots all over the place here. Whereas Bournemouth's 1.3 comes from just 4 chances. So that's around double the amount of expected goals for Arsenal from around 8 times as many shots. So Bournemouth being much more efficient than Arsenal. Now there's a sense in which Bournemouth's play style invites this kind of shot generation, because what they're going to do is they're going to sit deep against teams like Arsenal, they're going to absorb pressure, and when they win the ball back, they're going to try and transition quickly to the other side of the field and generate these big chances. And because the opposition are often spread out, it's much easier to generate better chances. So Bournemouth are generally creating these big chances here, whereas for Arsenal it's mainly little chances with a few big chances thrown in, and that's the gamble that Bournemouth make. But this got me thinking whether or not Arsenal's defensive problems actually emerged from the fact that they're not quite so good at defending in transition. And what I did is I broke down all of the goals that Arsenal have conceded this season, and I looked at the ones before the World Cup and after the World Cup, and what I found was actually, in terms of goals conceded from transitions, they're pretty much about the same before and after. So it's definitely not the case that Arsenal are getting worse transitionally. And going back to the Bournemouth game, actually these 2 chances were generated through set pieces. The first one was actually a kickoff routine that Bournemouth made, where they got the ball to Philip Billing really quickly. They scored within about 6 seconds. And the second one was a header from a corner. And that made me think maybe Arsenal are getting worse at set pieces. And again, on my graph here, what we can see is the set piece number after the World Cup here in red is much worse than the set piece figure here in white from before the World Cup. So it seems as though Arsenal are struggling a lot more from set pieces. Now, as an aside, it seems that Arsenal have got much better at defending goals from deep build-up than they were before the World Cup. Now, I had a look at the numbers, and actually what I found is that teams are much more likely to give Arsenal a bigger share of the possession now. So it seems as though a lot of teams are actually happy for Arsenal to possess the ball and sit a little bit deeper, which means that maybe there's fewer teams actually trying to build up deep against them as well. But back to set pieces, and what I've been able to find is that actually the numbers show that Arsenal have got worse from set pieces. So what I've got here is a rolling 5-game average for set piece XG conceded across the course of the season. So at the beginning of the season, we can see, as we might expect, that Arsenal are really good at keeping that expected goals against number from set pieces down, but we get to the World Cup and again it ramps right back up. We have this big peak here. Now it's worth saying again that there is that peak where Arsenal face 3 teams who are very good from set pieces. We've got Everton, Brentford and Manchester City, all of whom are very good, and so what they will be doing is generating a lot of set pieces and getting a lot of value from those set pieces. Now after this peak, we can see that the numbers do drop off, which may suggest that Arsenal have gotten better at defending set pieces. But it is worth remembering that this number is only generated when teams have set pieces. And there's a couple of games in this data set, a game against Everton when Everton lose 4-0, and a game against Leicester, we've already mentioned, where Leicester don't generate any expected goals at all, which means that the data is slightly skewed. So what this shows is that Arsenal are actually conceding fewer set pieces rather than defending them better. Now we can see that the number does jump up again at the end. That's because the Crystal Palace game enters the data set, and Crystal Palace generated around 0.4 expected goals from set pieces, and they actually scored as well. So we can see that Arsenal still do have problems from set pieces. So we can see then that a big reason for why Arsenal have gotten worse defensively after the World Cup is to do with the way that they are defending set pieces. And this is something that Arsenal have clearly recognised because they've changed the way that they're defending their set pieces recently. But before we get to that, let's just have a think about how Arsenal are defending set pieces, and particularly corners. So what I want to do is break down a number of different roles that the players play when they are defending set pieces. So the first group of players we need to think about are these players here on the edge of the 6-yard box. These are just zonal markers, so what their responsibility is to stay in this zone. If the ball comes towards them, they move towards it and head it out, and they are not going to be responding to what the opposition do too much. We've also got another zonal player here which Arsenal have used for most of the season, and this is just someone who sits on the front of the box, pretty much guarding the front post, but also the first player to be able to head the ball away if the ball comes into the front post as well. So these players are just all zonal, they're concerned about their zones, they're not worrying too much about the opposition players specifically. The second group of players are generally called blockers. So what you'll see here is often a group of players really close together here, and what their job is to stop the opposition runners into the box. So the opposition runners are going to try and get into the danger areas. These players have to block them. If they get past them, they then have to defend them man to man as well. Now this leaves a number of free players. Usually what Arsenal do is they'll have one player around this kind of area because the opposition will have a couple of floater players here, and this player will just sit in between them, making sure they can jump on them if the ball comes to them. But typically what happens is that one of these players will go in the middle, and Arsenal will allow them to be free because they're around this zonal section, so they trust their zonal players to clear the ball away there. And what will happen with the other two is that Arsenal players will go man for man on them. Now, if one of these players joins the group of runners, then that player will join the group of blockers as well. And so there's a level of flexibility there. So that's how Arsenal have defended corners roughly for most of the season. But actually what's happened recently is that they've changed the way that they are defending. So that's what the theory is like. Let's take a look at what it looks like in practice. So here's a screenshot from an Arsenal game against Brentford recently. And as we can see, we've got the 3 zonal players here on the edge of the 6-yard box. They're only concerned with their zone. They're going to step forward, try and head the ball away. And then we've got a 4th zonal player here in Eddie Nketiah, staying on the front post. He's guarding the front post, but he's also able to step forward and head the ball away should it come into the front post zone. And then everywhere else, we've got man-to-man options all the way across the field. Here's your 2 blockers against your 2 runners, and there's your guy on the near side of the box who's just floating if the ball comes out to the edge of the box. So that's what Arsenal were like against Brentford. I've got another situation here because this one shows up quite nicely, these blockers and runners. So 3 blockers, 3 runners. Here's the player on the edge of the box keeping these 2 guys occupied. And then what we've got here is 4 zonal players. So 1, 2, 3 on the edge of the 6-yard box, simply worried about the zones. And then we've got a 4th player here sitting on the front post, making sure that that zone is covered as well. And then everywhere else, we've got player for player, and there's a free man here in that zonal area as well. Now, this is a game against Sporting in the Europa League, and Arsenal actually did end up conceding a corner in this game. And clearly Arsenal recognise that they've got some kind of problem with defending set pieces because they have tweaked the way that they are defending them slightly. So within the next few days, they actually then come up against Fulham and they're defending it in a very different way. So as before, we've still got our 3 zonal defenders on the line of the 6-yard box covering their spaces, but we no longer have a front post zonal player. That player has been moved into the group of players blocking or man marking. So what we can see now is we've got 3 blockers here against 3 opposition runners, and then across the field, all of these players are man marked. And then we have our usual near side of the box player here to make sure that these 2 players are being covered. So a player has moved from here, from a zonal situation, into one of the more direct man marking situations as well. But interestingly, if we move on to look at the next game, which is the second leg against Sporting, here's our 3 zonal players. But now you can see we've got man-to-man players across the line here, and Zinchenko, who is being used as the front post marker, is now being used as a man marker. So that if we zoom out for the same corner, we can see 3 zonal players, and then man-to-man, 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 all of the blockers on the runners. There's a runner just off screen here, and there's our floating box guy as well. So Arsenal have changed the way that they're defending set pieces. They now only have 3 zonal players rather than 4, and they've added a player into the mix where they can be man marking. Now, my hypothesis is that Arsenal consider that front post zonal player to be a bit of a waste, and so what they want is they want to use him actually in a more physical duel because they feel as though they're getting overrun in these set piece moments. So is Arsenal's defending a problem? Well, it's clear that the numbers have got worse for them defensively after the World Cup, and a big chunk of this seems to be to do with the way that they're defending set pieces. But it's also worth remembering that despite the fact that their defensive numbers are getting worse, they are still putting up much more expected goals than they are conceding expected goals against. And interestingly enough, Arsenal clearly recognising the areas where their defensive deficiencies are coming from, and they're doing things to try and overcome those problems.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.